Hey everyone, welcome to another Patreon topic video. This one is for Nathaniel Davis, and it's a simple question with a complicated answer. So the simple question is, how do you get started in Shmups? Where do you start? Where do you start in Shmups? If you're coming into the genre, you're interested, what are the steps to proceed with? So I've been giving this a lot of thought because I think this is an important topic to try and get right. I think the first thing you need to do, step one, is you need to do a little bit of self-reflection and kind of ask yourself, what am I looking for? What attracts me to Shmups? Why am I interested? And what am I looking for the genre to give me? Because the thing about Shmups is that they can give you many different things depending on what you're looking for. And in fact, sometimes they can give you one thing if you're looking for it, or they can give you the opposite. So for instance, I'll talk about why I started playing Shmups, what I was looking for. Basically, again, I was playing a lot of fighting games, and I was getting frustrated because a lot of the games that I enjoyed and was competitive in were losing popularity, and people were quitting or moving on. And so it's like, okay, now I'm just gonna go to the tournament and beg people to play me. It got frustrating for me. That's the thing about fighting games, is that they are a time and place type game. And so I was thinking, okay, I want to start looking into, on the side, playing some single player games that sort of engage that competitive aspect of me, but aren't, too far away from arcade games and fighters. And so Shmups were the perfect fit, right? They fit what I was looking for. I wanted a competitive experience, and a hard, in-depth genre, but had a single player component where I wasn't dependent on other players to actually play the game. And so that's what brought me into Shmups. And so when I came into it, I was looking for growing my skill set, competing, all that kind of thing. So I was coming into it with the expectation of engaging on the genre on that level. And so that might be a little bit different than what brings other people into the genre. I know some people I've talked to enjoy Shmups because they enjoy the history of the games, or they enjoy kind of the design aspects of the games, that sort of side of things, rather than competitive play. And so if you're coming into the genre for those reasons, your roadmap might look, a little bit different than what I'll tell you to do. So I'm going to assume, or some people come into Shmups for collecting, right? And that's like a whole different sphere of the genre, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of give you the roadmap for if you're coming into the genre to play it somewhat competitively. So you're not necessarily having to chase world records or those types of things, but you basically want to be able to impress your friends and family members with your skills at the games, or at least impress yourself a little bit with the skills of the games. You want to try and engage with the genre in a scoring capacity. So this is where there's an interesting divergence based on who you talk to. So there are people, and neither of these perspectives are necessarily wrong, it's just what path is better for you. And so I'll say what path I went down, but basically when you decide, okay, I'm going to start playing Shmups somewhat seriously, right? I'm going to try and clear them, get high scores, all those sorts of things. You then have to ask yourself, okay, where do I want to start? Do I want to start playing for survival, or do I want to start immediately playing for score? And I know there are certain people that have very strong opinions on which option to choose. Personally, just from what I've observed over the past 2 years, people taking these different routes and these different approaches, as well as what I've experienced. Because in some games I've gone scoring first, in some games I've gone survival first. So in my opinion, in my experience, I actually think that players who come in and focus on survival first, for the most part, not always, but for the most part, tend to stick around and stick to their games longer than people who come in and immediately try and start playing for high scores. And the reason for that is, again, it depends on the game, right? So if your game isn't that difficult, if you're not having any difficulties scoring or surviving, yeah, go ahead and start playing for score. But the issue is when you come into certain games like Gurega, like Dodonpachi, like Ketsui. The interesting thing about some of these games, especially Dodonpachi, Gurega not so much, but especially Dodonpachi, is that the scoring and survival choices of this game greatly differ from each other. So what you would do in your scoring routing would be opposite of what you'd want to do for pure survival, and the same way around. Things you would do for pure survival greatly affect your score. For instance, my 2-wall was played with survival in mind, not scoring. So ironically, even though I got a 2-wall, which was I consider a very difficult, long endeavor, I probably could beat my 2-wall score in a weekend if I just focused on scoring in the first loop and carrying my max bonus. I'm pretty sure I could beat that score in a weekend or two. Just because the survival route I was doing basically obliterated my scoring. So that's the first step you want to try and figure out is, okay, am I going to come in and start playing for survival, or I'm going to try and jump into scoring right away? If you're more interested in jumping into scoring, so now we're making more sub-branches, right? So if you're interested in, I want to play for score right away, that's my goal, try and seek a game where the scoring is pretty well integrated into survival, where they're not opposing each other. So Dodonpachi is not where you want to go, because the way Dodonpachi works is that not only is the scoring extremely strict and brutal, no leniency whatsoever, but it also places you in more danger constantly than playing for survival. So they're opposed to each other. So I would not recommend Dodonpachi. I would say if you want to score in Dodonpachi, that's like a later journey. But let's say you want to play Dodonpachi right away. I think actually playing it for survival is a great way to get into the genre, a great place to get started. Your scores aren't going to be great, but the thing about Dodonpachi that is kind of cool is if you don't want to engage with the chaining and all that sort of thing, just no miss, no bombing actually can give you a pretty decent score for Western players, I guess, because that max bonus is so potent. So there is that option. But let's say you want to jump into scoring right away. I think some games you should consider are things like Ketsui, Battle Gurega, and Crimson Clover World Ignition. I think these are great games for that. Or maybe play something like Danmaku Unlimited 3 at a lower difficulty. That's another great place to get started. So if you're wanting to score right away and not play for survival, I would point you towards easier games with more accessible scoring, or games like Ketsui, Gurega, Crimson Clover, where the scoring and survival are more intertwined rather than being opposed to each other, like in Dodonpachi games, like DOJ and DDP, right? So there's that branch. But let's say you take the branch that I went down, which was, I'm just going to play for survival. And what's interesting is that that's mostly frowned upon by most people within the shmup scene, especially when I got started. Most people did not like the idea of recommending playing for survival to newcomers, because the fear is that on the forum there were a lot of players who pretty much only played for survival and never played for score, and that kind of was becoming a thing, or at least an argument I saw a bunch, is that playing for score is whatever, playing for survival's the way to go, or it's a complicated issue. But anyway, but the thing is I feel, and Jamers echoed this as well when I interviewed him on the podcast, we both felt that playing for survival is a legitimate first step because it builds that foundation. Prometheus also said that he did this with Dodonpachi. When I interviewed him, I assumed that he just went into Dodonpachi and started scoring and chaining and all that stuff right away, but he said he actually played the game for a year or so for survival, just like I did. So I don't think there's anything wrong with starting for survival. And what tends to happen, and what happened to me anyway, is that for a while I was just like, okay, I'm just going to play for survival. That's all I care about. I just want to clear, the clears are what I'm going for. But there comes a point when you start getting clears and you start getting more clears, then the clears start to come easier and easier to you, where, okay, it doesn't take me 3 months to clear this game, now it only takes me a month. Or for me with Ketsui, it didn't take me very long to get my survival 1 all when I just sat down and focused on it. And so when you're starting to get to that kind of skill bracket where, okay, now I'm able to get these clears somewhat quickly, that's when I think the next step would be, okay, now let's start engaging with scoring, because otherwise you're just going to kind of be on a treadmill. So those are the 2 options you have coming to get started as far as, do you want to play for score? Do you want to play for survival? Another quick aspect of this topic I wanted to touch on is, when you're getting started, how do you choose the first game you want to play? I know I recommended in that video that I think Touhou Imperishable Night is the best, like, universal game to get started with as far as building up your skills. But that's kind of an introductory game to the genre. When I recommend that, I'm not recommending that as your first, like, serious scoring game, the game that you really commit to. You can if you want. It's a great game, but I'm saying what you want to do is you want to start looking for, what game do I feel like I can commit to? What game really pulls me in and keeps bringing me back, basically? And for some people, that can be a real struggle. Even people who've been around a long time can sometimes struggle to find that game that they want to come back and play for score over and over and over, right? For me, it was Dodonpachi. I just could not get away from that game. I just always wanted to play it. I'd put it down, then I'd come back to it. And so just keep an eye out for games like that. I know Dingo, for him, was Refrain. I remember when he first joined my server, he was going through different games, trying to find one that he really connected with. And he kept coming back to Refrain. That game just kept pulling him in. And so keep an eye out for that as well when you're playing and going through, kind of just trying out different games at first. What game seems to pull me back? What game keeps me coming back? What game intrigues me? I think that's the most important factor to consider when you're considering what game do I start with. For instance, Garega isn't necessarily the easiest game to get started with, but I remember Eaglet mentioned it just kept pulling him back, and he went on to be, an amazing Garega player, and an amazing Shmup player overall. So also keep that in mind, is even if it's a really challenging game, like Ketsui, like Garega, if that game just seems to speak to you and keep pulling you back in over and over, there's something there. So yeah, maybe consider starting to really sink into that game and committing with it. And then if it's a game that feels a bit over your head, like Dodonpachi was for me, I would say go ahead and just start playing it for survival. Put those hours in, and you'll be surprised, because when I've started now kind of dipping into playing Dodonpachi for score, I found, this is not as jarring and brutal of a transition as I think people were expecting, because I basically memorized the entire game, so it's not that hard to go from a different route to another route when you have the entire game memorized. So there's also that too, where even if you're playing a completely different route for survival, you're still learning the boss fights, you're still learning the stage layouts, you're still learning how the game functions. And so yes, you're going to have to do some backtracking and rerouting, but you actually won't be as far behind as you would actually think. So I hope this helps. I think it can be a very daunting proposition when you're getting started, because there's so many options and so many conflicting ways of how you could go about things. So before I close out, I'd like to thank my patrons: Dingo, Anthony A, Brian Shiver, Double Vision, Dunpeel 2064, Full Set, Retro Schmupper, Kiwi, Jacob Spring, Jake Ryan, J Lab, Joe Angelo, K, Kinotosi, Mark Sloan, Maz, Nathaniel Davis, the man of the video, and Electron, Omcall, Psych, Plasmo, Rhizosis, Tsugumo, and Young Money Sweet. Thanks for watching.